Welcome, and thank you for joining us on our live stream. We believe here at Active that you are worth knowing, so we created this content designed for you to explore your faith and belief wherever you're at. So welcome, and please enjoy the message.
morning, Active Church. How you feeling? Doing good? Great to see you. My name is Mike, if we haven't met yet, and I serve on the team here at Active Church. I want to welcome you to Yucaipa, and I want to welcome those watching from our Redlands location. You are joining us for the final week of a series called Better. And all month long, we've been wrestling with this question: what story do you want to tell? See, we believe at Active that you and I, no matter who we are, no matter where we come from, no matter what we've done, we can tell a better story. And getting started is always the most difficult part of telling a better story. And so all month long, we've been defining what it looks like to tell a better story. We've been getting very practical. And if you've missed any of the weeks, you can always go back to our podcast. It's on Spotify and iTunes. But I want to get you caught up, so if you missed, you're going to know where we're going today. In week one, we talked about the most essential piece to telling a better story. We talked about how you and I are better when we choose to do life with God rather than without God. Because we believe that God will make you better at life and make your life better. And so that day was an incredible day. We had Baptism Sunday. It was awesome. And if you're thinking about baptisms, you can sign up for that today just by checking the box on the card in the seat back in front of you. Our next Baptism Sunday is on Easter Sunday. Then week two of this series, we talked about the most important piece of telling a better story, of becoming better. And it was this: that you and I are better when we do life together. We're better when we're in relationship, and when those relationships are intentional, when we decide to lean in and not choose isolation, but we choose to be together. And we invited you to sign up for a connection group, and hundreds of you have done that. And if you're interested, you can always stop by Guest Central and they can get you started and help you to find the best group for you. And then week three, last week, we talked about how you and I are better with purpose. This was the most significant piece of telling a better story, because it means that our life isn't random, that we're not accidents, that there is a reason for our existence. And the reason is because God made us and designed us and had created us for something very specific. Which brings us to our final week, and what I believe is the most courageous piece in telling a better story. Today we're going to talk through this idea that you and I are better with influence, that we're better when we understand our influence, we're better when we live within our influence, we're better when we use our influence to help others tell a better story. Now, influence is felt most prominent on social media. If you have a preteen or a teenager at home, or you are around preteens or teenagers, you have felt the influence of social media, because there's this app called TikTok, all right? And here's what it's done to our preteens and our teenagers. They don't normally walk normal anymore, do they? Like when I go walking, I walk like this. You know, here I am, walking, right? But when my teenagers and my preteens, and maybe your teenagers and your preteens, when they go walking, they walk and then suddenly they go, right? Like, I've been working on that for about 2 days. Abby, my oldest, has been teaching me the TikTok dances. I still don't think I have it down, but I know like the whoa. I don't know all of it, but I'm old. And so, but I've realized that TikTok has this incredible influence that now suddenly we just break out and dance, and it's normal. Before TikTok, we thought somebody was having a seizure, you know? Now it's just dancing, right? The power of influence on social media is spectacular. Businesses, organizations have reached out to men and women that have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of followers, and they pay them a resource to do product placement. So that when you and I actually see what they're talking about, they're hoping that we're going to purchase that product because that person talked about it, took a photo with it, whatever the case might be. And we saw the power of this take place just a couple of years ago. In around 2017, 3 really influential Instagrammers, they posted this photo, a photo of an orange square. And then they hashtagged it Firefest. And so, of course, everybody who followed them was intrigued by this, so everybody Googled, what is Firefest? And they discovered that Firefest was short for Fire Festival. And it was going to be this incredible concert on this private island, much in the same vein as like Coachella or Stagecoach, or for those of you that want to jump in the Wayback Machine, Woodstock, right? Like it was this incredible experience on this private island. You would have gourmet food, you would have incredible places to stay, all sorts of celebrities and all sorts of bands were gonna be there. And so of course, people were intrigued by this. They watched the video. It was people on the beach in bathing suits and on boats running. And so of course people are like, I'm gonna spend money on this. And so they got their tickets and they got their airplane tickets and they were gonna fly out to the Fyre Fest because they wanted to be a part of this inaugural event simply because people posted this photo, this orange photo on their Instagram. Now, if you're not familiar with the Fyre Festival, you need to be, because it's a fantastic story. Because the Fyre Festival never actually happened. Because the two men that were behind it were con men. And they didn't make any plans for people to come and be a part of this thing. They were just trying to be around celebrities and around bands. And so people who thought they were showing up to a paradise with all sorts of incredible places to stay and incredible food, when they arrived, it looked like a homeless refugee camp. They used the tents that they used during Hurricane Andrew in Florida. They set those tents up and they served everybody cheese sandwiches. And they showed up going, we spent thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the leaders of this organization were like, yeah, sorry. And so this event never took place. There's 2 documentaries on Hulu and on Netflix. If you get a chance to watch it, just know that there's some adult content, but it is phenomenal at what happened. But it all started because 1 or 2 people posted an orange square and hashtagged it Firefest. And people wanted to know because they were influenced by these social media influencers. Now, when we talk about influencers, I think you might do what I do. You might dismiss yourself from that group. You're like, listen, when I post something on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, I might get 1 like. I might get 1 comment. I don't even know if people are even looking at my page, right? But then when you think about your life, you're like, I don't have that influence. I don't think that I have an impact on people. But there's something in the scriptures that I think we need to be reminded of every single day. Something that the writers of the scriptures talk about, something that God talks about, something that Jesus helped us to understand when he walked the earth. And it was that you have great influence. And I know that you might think, well, just because we make the statement about it doesn't mean that it's true, but there is a test that we take here at Active Church to help you know if you have influence or not. And we've taken this test before, and some of you know what's coming, and others of you are brand new, and so you're getting ready to take this test with us. It's a simple test, all right? I'm gonna ask you a question, and then I want you to raise your hand, both locations, if this is true of you, all right? So here's the question. How many of you have ever been asked for your opinion, your thoughts, or your wisdom on anything since you've been born? Raise your hand. Awesome. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Redlands, keep your hands up. Look around the room. Look at all the influencers in this place. You know what's so funny is whenever I say look around the room, there are people that are like, I don't want to be in that category. I'm not an influencer, right? And I think the reason why we feel like we're not influencers is because of the responsibility that comes with that, right? We know that there's a responsibility in knowing that we could use our influence to help others tell a better story. There's a weight that comes from that. It's the reason why we tell our kids, hey, be a good influence. It's the reason why we tell them, hey, don't be around those kids because those are bad influences, right? It's the reason why some of you have specifically chosen this school to send your kids to because you want them to be in a good environment. See, we know intuitively that there is influence that's inside of us that's gonna come out. It's not something that we get, it's something that we have, and we get to make a decision on how we're going to use it. So let me just be honest with you this morning. You are influencing. You just get to decide if you're gonna use it to help others become better or not. You are influencing in what you say and in what you do. You're just deciding in what you say and in what you do if you're gonna help others tell a better story or if you're going to hurt them as their story unfolds. And I know that's heavy And I know that there's a responsibility that comes with that, but this is why we started this conversation at the beginning of this month with the most essential piece to telling a better story, that you and I are better with God. Because when we trust in God, have faith in God, when we believe in God, then we're not doing this thing on our own. That it's not just up to us. When we believe in Jesus, when we begin a relationship with Jesus, we have the God of the universe by our side. We have the Spirit of God in our body, in our bones, in our hearts, and our minds. And yes, there are going to be moments where we're not going to do this perfectly, but God never invited us to influence perfectly. God invited us to influence with intentionality. And this is why it's so important that we choose to pursue God from wherever we're at. Because the responsibility of influence, it's huge, it's heavy, it can be a weight. But here's what you discover as you engage a story with God and you engage a relationship with Jesus, that you're not alone in this. That he gives you the energy and the courage to be able to step into your influence. And along the way, you begin to grow in your understanding of God. You're not saying when you trust in Jesus that you have God figured out. It would be like you, for those of you that have gotten married, it would be like you standing up here on this stage and saying that I'm marrying this person because I know them completely. No, you don't. And all of us would know that you don't. That would be a foolish statement. What you're saying is I fell in love and I want to grow in my knowledge and understanding and I want to learn and discover this person. And that is what a relationship with Jesus looks like. A relationship with God through Jesus Christ looks like. And that influence is our influence. Because your understanding of God shapes your influence in your world. How you understand God will come out in how you interact with the people around you. And that's where I want to wrestle with this morning. That's what I want to wrestle with this morning. Because how you understand God will influence what you do and where you do it and how you do it and whom you do this with, whom you influence and how you influence. And so this morning, I want to tell you two stories of two influencers. Their stories are found in the pages and documents that we call the Bible. And they had a moment, a real moment with God that changed them. It changed their real life. Their understanding of God in that moment influenced how they influenced. And so I want to tell you two stories this morning. And then I want to tell you how it can impact our influence. And then I want to ask you a really important question, a question that I believe could be a game changer for you in telling a better story and helping others tell a better story. So if you brought a Bible with you this morning, or if you have the Bible app on your phone, the first story that we're going to engage with is found in 2 Kings chapter 5. It's in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures of the Bible. So I'll give you a second to turn there. If you don't have a Bible or you're not using your phone or the Bible app on your phone this morning, we'll have the verses on the screen and there'll be some notes to help you engage and follow along. The first story is about an incredible warrior, highly respected. His name is Naaman. And we engage his story in 2 Kings chapter 5, starting in verse 1. And the writer tells us this. Now Naaman was a commander of the army of the king of Aram. And he was great in the sight of his master. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Leprosy is not a disease that we deal with in our culture. In fact, doctors have figured out how to cure leprosy. In the last 20 years, there were 1,000 cases of leprosy, and they were cured. It's the reason why you don't hear about it anymore. But leprosy would attack your nervous system. It would attack the nerve endings in your fingers and in your toes, and it would cause the fingers and toes to go dead. And eventually you would lose them. This disease was also very contagious. And so if you were diagnosed with this disease, you could not be around anyone. And so you'll see in the scriptures that those that have leprosy actually find themselves living in the same home together because they can't be around healthy people because there was no cure during that time. Truthfully, if you were diagnosed with leprosy, leprosy was a death sentence for you. There was no hope. There was no the best is yet to come. There was no you can tell a better story. Everybody just knew that the end was coming. They just didn't know when it was coming. But they knew that it was coming fast, and you would live the rest of your life in isolation. So imagine being a valiant soldier, full of integrity and character, someone who is highly respected and always around people, even the king. And now you have this disease. The writer tells us in verse 2 that bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to Naaman's wife, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, which is in Israel, he would cure him of leprosy." This would be a moment where the wife might have first responded with, "You're talking crazy. You've been watching too many TikToks, all right? This is a little bit kooky talk." And yet, there was something in what this girl was saying that maybe Naaman's wife and Naaman himself hadn't felt since the diagnosis. And it was hope. Hope is like oxygen for your soul. Hope is like when you're really tired in the morning and then the coffee hits your lips and suddenly you're wide awake. Hope is energy in your bones. Hope really believes that the best is yet to come. Not just fingers crossed, I wish this was the case, but when you place your hope in Jesus, when your hope is found in the God of the universe, then there is a promise that God will go with you in the next season, no matter what that season might be, knowing that you have the God of the universe on your side. And here's this girl, slave girl, who says to her master's wife, "You know, if you went to Israel, I'm pretty sure that there's someone there that could heal you of this, even though there's not a cure." And so verse 4 and 5 tells us that Naaman went to his master, the king, and told him what the girl had said from Israel. And then he said to the king, "Could I go?" And the king said, "Of course, I'll send a letter to the king of Israel, letting him know that you're going to arrive." And Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. See, the reason why Naaman needed to bring a letter to this king is because he's a mighty warrior, and he's stepping into a foreign land, and their expectation would be that he is there to start a war and to take over. So his king needed to send a letter to the king of Israel, and the reason why he brought resource was because during that time, they believed that the kings of the land represented their gods to the people. In other words, the closest person to God, whoever they worshiped in that land, the closest person to God would be the king. And he wanted to convince the king to ask his God to heal him. And if he didn't want to do that, then Naaman brought money, resource, ways to convince him so that he wouldn't have to be this person with leprosy and living with this disease that would lead to his death. And the king of Israel receives this letter, and Naaman comes to his throne room, and the king of Israel is thrown by this. He says, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of leprosy? I think he's trying to mess with me," is what it literally reads. And it says he tears his robes. He's so frustrated. And then in that city lived a man named Elisha. And he's kind of the pastor, the prophet of the time. And we read that when Elisha, the man of God, heard this, he sent a message to the king and he said, "Hey, have this man come to me and he will know that there is a prophet and there is a God in Israel." So the king says, "Hey, you should go see Elisha." So Naaman takes all of his resource, all of his men, all of his chariots, all of his camels. He rolls up to the home of Elisha and he knocks on the door. And Elisha doesn't even come to the door. He must have had the ring and he knew that somebody was there, right? Who answers the door anymore anyway, right? He sends his servant Gehazi. So his servant opens the door and says, oh, hi, Elisha told me that you wanted to be cured of leprosy, and so here's what you need to do. You need to go and you need to dip yourself in the Jordan River 7 times. Have a great day. And he closes the door. And Naaman is irate. He's frustrated. He's angry because he's like, first, this guy doesn't even come to see me. He didn't see all of the resource that I brought him. And doesn't he know who I am? Like, I don't go and dip in any kind of river. The Jordan River was used by a lot of people, and when they would wash their clothes and wash their tools and wash whatever it was, they would wash themselves. So it was deemed to be like a disgusting river. And Naaman wanted to dip maybe, and he says, I wanted to dip in the Euphrates, which was much better. It's like the difference between, for those of you that live locally and you know this, it's the difference between like Lake Powell and Lake Paris, right? And you're laughing because you know that there's a difference, right? And so Naaman's like, I'm not going in the dirty water. I'm going to go over here. And he throws a fit. And he has a servant that says to him, Master, if he was going to ask you to do something great and extraordinary, wouldn't you do it? So why not just try it? Because you're already going to die anyway. What have you got to lose? You're so worried about your dignity, but friend, master, you're going to be dead soon. So just put your dignity aside for a second and maybe be obedient, because perhaps something extraordinary is going to happen. So Naaman marches himself down to the river. He's probably grumbling and complaining the entire time because he's like you and me, right? And he gets into the water and he dips down the first time, and he dips down the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time. And the writer tells us that he went down and he dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times. And when he came up, his flesh was restored. In fact, the writer says that it was restored to like a form of a baby. And he's a warrior. So not only did he have leprosy, but he has been in battle. So he probably has scars and wounds, and he's older, so he probably has wrinkles. So this moment is like the first form, and it's like the godly form of Botox, right? Like he dips down and comes back up and goes, oh my goodness, look at me. And he's thrilled. Of course he's thrilled. He's not gonna die anymore, and he looks good. And so he goes back to Elisha and he finds him and he says, let me give you all this resource. Let me give you all this stuff. Let me just thank you. And Elisha goes, I didn't do anything. I'm not going to take credit for what God did. God did this. And then Naaman makes a really interesting request, because Elisha doesn't take his resource. Naaman says, okay, well then please let me be given as much earth or dirt as a pair of my mules can carry. And give this to your servant, who will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other God but the Lord. And Elisha responds with these words, you got it. Go in peace. And that's the end of the first story. The first influencer. I want to tell you the second story. You might know the name of this person. His name is Moses. And his story is found in the document called Exodus. Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. We're introduced to Moses. He was an Israelite who was born of Jewish descent. And because the Egyptians were threatening the Jews and were going to kill their firstborn, Moses' mom hides him, and he gets found out by someone in Pharaoh's household, and she adopts him. Along the way, Moses realizes that he has Jewish descent, and he flees. He leaves the country, and he meets a new family, and he's building a new life. And it's this where we pick up the story of Moses. And the writer of Exodus tells us that now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within the bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So here's Moses minding his own business, newly married, working for his father-in-law, and he sees a fire. And so of course that's going to draw anybody's attention, let alone a young man. So he walks over and he makes this observation that this bush is on fire, but it's not burning up. How odd. And then a voice comes from the bush, which might be really, really strange for everyone, including Moses. But before he could actually consider what was happening, the voice says to Moses, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for this place where you are standing is holy ground." And then this voice introduces himself. And he says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then God says, "Here's why I'm speaking to you. My people have been crying out to be freed from slavery. They've been in slavery in Egypt for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I've heard their cry, and I'm gonna set them free. And guess who's going to lead the way, Moses? You are." And Moses does what all of us would do in that moment. Moses says to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? There's got to be someone better, God. There's got to be someone more courageous, with more energy, maybe someone who looks better than me, maybe someone who has a better story than I have. There's got to be someone better." And I think this is a moment that we all can relate to. Because whenever we're invited to step out in courage, especially when it has to do with what God is doing on earth, isn't it true that we first go to, who am I? What do I have? I think all of us wrestle with self-esteem issues. We just don't talk about it. I question often, who am I? Why do I get to do what I get to do? Why would anybody want to sit and listen to the words that I'm sharing? You might question, who are you? Why do you get to do what you get to do? Who's going to pay attention to you as you lead your business or your organization or your family? Who are you? And Moses feels the same way. Who am I? He begins to give God all sorts of excuses. God, I don't know how to talk in front of people. And God says, that's okay, I'll give you your brother Aaron. He's able to talk. If you can't, he's going to speak eloquently to the Pharaoh. He goes, God, but if I go, they're not going to believe that you sent me. And God says, tell them that I am sent you. The one true God sent you. Moses goes, well, what if they don't believe my words? And God says, great, show them the power that you are coming in. How do I do that, God? And he says, take your hand, place it inside your jacket. So he does, he pulls it back out. It's covered in leprosy, which has no cure. And then he says, place that hand back in your jacket. So he does, he pulls it back out. It's cured. Then he says, throw down your stick. Throws a stick down and it turns into a snake. And then God says, pick it back up. And Moses went, really? And he said, yes. So he picks it back up. It turns back into a staff. The whole time, Moses is trying to remove himself from using his influence to help others tell a better story. And the entire time, God fights him on that. Here's what I love about this moment. God doesn't disagree with Moses that he can't speak in front of people. And God doesn't disagree with Moses that they may not believe that he's from God. And God doesn't disagree with Moses that he doesn't have any power. God knows exactly who Moses is. And yet he said, I'm not looking for you to be extraordinary. I'm looking for you to be obedient. And he says the same thing to you. I'm not looking for you to be like them. I'm looking for you to be you. And by the way, God doesn't get angry with Moses. God takes as much time as Moses needed to be convinced that God was actually choosing him. And God will take all the time that you need to let you know just exactly who you are and what he's created you to do. See, we have a choice to make. You have influence, and you decide how you will use it. I have influence, and I decide how I'm going to use it. And at the end of this conversation, God convinces Moses that this is the best way forward. And we're told in Exodus chapter 4, verse 18, a whole 2 chapters later, that finally Moses went back. And that's the end of his story. Two stories of two influencers. Two very different understandings of God. And let me explain their understanding. Story number one is the story of Naaman. He asks at the end of this story, could I have enough dirt for my mule? Because in his understanding of God is also the cultural understanding of God. That wherever you went, whatever land you went into, whatever God they worshiped, that God was stuck to the land. And so in order for Naaman to take this God that healed him, the one true God that he wants to worship, in order for that God to go into his world, into his land, he needed dirt from the land where he was healed from. And he needed to carry that dirt into his land because he said, when I go back, I'm going to have to kneel down to the God of Ramon because that was my obligation with the king. But when I kneel, I want the one true God to know that I am kneeling to him. That's why I want the dirt of this land to represent that. To which many of you, if you're good Christians in the room here in Yucaipa and in Redlands, you would respond with, well, at that moment you begin to explain that that's a limited understanding of God, that's not how God works, and that he needed to get some clarity as to how God works. And you know what Elisha does? He doesn't do any of that. Elisha goes, go in peace. Because he understands that Naaman is growing in his understanding of God. Is it limited? Yes. But this is Naaman's first step. But his understanding of God, his first step, limits his influence because what Naaman believed is what the culture believed. That God is in the spaces that we decide. He's limited by our boundaries. He's limited by our walls. He's limited by our perspective and by our beliefs. But story number two expands that understanding of God. Story number two is the story of Moses. And there's a narrative in this story that we gloss over. We're so caught up in the bush that's on fire, that's not burning. But God says to Moses, take off your sandals, for where you are standing is holy ground. So he does. Removes both. And if you go back to Exodus 3 and 4 today at some point and you read it through, there's going to be a narrative piece that is not found in the story at all. And I believe it's not found, and that's intentional. Because in this story, we are never told that Moses puts his sandals back on. Now, logically, reasonably, all of us might go, well, it's the desert, so he probably put his sandals back on, to which I would say, you're right. But there are theologians that believe, and I believe this as well, that that was intentionally left out because Moses grew in his understanding of God. Moses began to understand that if this space is holy and God is sending me and God is with me, then that must mean that everywhere I go is holy. In other words, his understanding grew to that God is in the spaces he decides. That God is already there. That we don't have to bring him with us. God is bigger than us. That we don't have to carry something with us in order for God to be present. That God is present. Which brings up a really interesting question. How does this shape our influence? Well, if you hold the perspective that Naaman holds, then you will begin to believe that God is here. And I'm not just talking about God dwelling with us. I'm talking about that God is only here. And if God is only here in these four walls here in Yucaipa and those four walls in Redlands, then we have limited God to this space, which means that suddenly this building is the church, not you and not me. That suddenly you and I have no stories to tell because all of the stories that we're going to hear and be inspired by are going to be stories that are brought to us by whoever stands on this stage. Suddenly our faith is reliant upon somebody else. It's their responsibility for us to lean into the story of God. And then all week long, we long to be back at church. Because when we hold this perspective, suddenly this space becomes a place of destination. That we only can interact with God when we arrive. when we show up. And you know, even if you're new to this, even if you're not sure about this, you know that seems so foreign and so odd and so untrue, because it is. Because the story of Moses is the perspective that I hope that you and I would walk out of here with. That God isn't here, but that God is everywhere. That God is already working. That God was there before you were there. God knew you would make the decision to trust in Jesus before you ever made that decision to trust in Jesus. God knew you that when you were going to make that decision to get baptized before you made the decision to get baptized. God was already there working in that person that you've been praying for and thinking about and loving through and wondering if they're ever going to take the step into telling a better story. God already knew that. He's setting the table for you. And your job and my job as people who love Jesus is to lean into our influence to point out God in those moments. Do you know that God can have a real interaction and a real moment with a real atheist? I mean, when did God become real to you? It wasn't when you were a Christian. It was probably in those moments where you had no control and the only thing you could do is cry out and say, "Help me, God." That's a real moment with God. And that's when God becomes real. And when we believe that God is everywhere, it shapes how we see our world, it shapes how we see our worlds, and it shapes how we see this place. This place becomes a space of inspiration. Suddenly the walls don't represent the church, we are. Suddenly the stories aren't just stories that are shared from the stage, we have them. Names, places, times, circumstances, struggles, joys, wins. We fill our hands with them during the week because we understand that God has sent us to point out the work that God is already doing. And so suddenly coffee shops become holy. And digging holes with coworkers become holy. And sitting around the coffee table becomes holy. And drives to work become holy. And singing as loud as you can in your car with your family becomes holy. Because you recognize that God is everywhere. God is here. God is doing something. And he doesn't need me to bring him. He is already there. What he needs me to do is bring him up in the way that I speak and in the way that I live. Our hands are full of these stories. And then we come into this place and we lay those stories, those names, those circumstances, we lay those down before the throne of God. And we ask God to do a good work and to believe that the best is yet to come and to tell a better story. And God, eventually would they come and sit with me in this place of inspiration. Our hearts get stirred, we get convicted, we get challenged, we get reminded, and we leave this place with our hands empty and our hearts full, ready to do it again. That's what it means to be the church, and that's what it means to hold the perspective that God is everywhere. And that is how it influences your influence. You begin to live in the rhythm that chooses to invest and invite. Investment is you choosing to have an open mind and open hands and an open heart. An open mind is someone who decides that I'm going to work to understand those that I don't understand. Because when I say I don't understand something, I'm making a statement more about me than I am about them. I don't understand why they would say that or live that way or behave that way or vote that way. You know what you're saying? You're making a judgment case about yourself. And when you have an open mind, you are learning and working and discovering what this person is all about so that you can help them to tell a better story, that you can help them meet Jesus and learn to follow Jesus, because that is the best way to live. That's why you live that way. And then when you have an open mind, it leads you to having open hands where you recognize that all of this is a gift. All of it's a gift. You didn't earn it. It's been given to you. So treat it with dignity and value. Treat them with dignity and value. Because a person is not someone that needs to be fixed. A person is someone that needs to be loved. And that is when you're really leaning into your influence. And when you have open hands, it begins to shape your open heart, where you recognize that God is still doing a good work in me. I need the gospel of Jesus Christ. As I follow Jesus now for almost 33 years, I still need the gospel of Jesus Christ in my life. I still need to be reminded that I don't need to carry around bitterness and unforgiveness and anger and rage. That I'm gonna get rid of those things. I'm literally gonna tie them up in trash bags and set it on the side of the curb so that they can get away from me, so that I can have a heart that is open to the movement of God, because God is everywhere. He's everywhere. And I want to be aware of it. I want to have my eyes open to it. And when you invest, it gives you the opportunity to invite. It's why when you walked in today, you were given one of these cards. These cards are not for you, by the way. I know that they can have a tendency to find their way into our wallets, or maybe on our refrigerator, or maybe in between the crack of our seat in our car and the cup holder, right? You clean out your car today, you're gonna find invites from the last 6 years at Active Church. These invites are for those that you love. And I would invite you to invite them to come and sit with you, because this is a place of inspiration where they can meet God, they can meet Jesus and learn to follow Jesus, and they are introduced because you've invested in them. And perhaps you need to move from just being general about your invitation and being specific. Instead of inviting someone to come sit with you someday, invite them to come sit with you Sunday. Because next Sunday we start a brand new series called You Have Permission. And the thing we're gonna be talking about is how to live confidently in what God has created us to do. And next week we're gonna talk about the thing that everybody deals with. We're gonna talk about how you have permission to doubt. And I know that's scary, and I know that might seem weird, but we're gonna talk about that next week. And maybe the person that you've been engaging with has doubts, and next week might be the perfect Sunday for them to come sit with you. I told you that I was gonna share with you 2 stories of influencers, their understanding of God, how it shapes their influence and ours. And then I was gonna ask you a question, and this is the most important question that I think we could ask of ourselves at any point in our life and in our faith. It's this: who's becoming better because of you? Who's becoming better because of you? Here's why this question is so important. Because when we talk about these things, whether we're new to this or we've been doing this a long time, we talk about it in generalities. Yes, people who are followers of Jesus should do that. Yes, the church should do that. Yes, they should do that. But this question makes it specific. This question moves it from here's what we should do to here's what I'm gonna do. You give a face and a name to the who in your life that's becoming better because of you. By the way, if you want your faith to grow, you want your faith to go deep, become strong, you don't need another Bible study. Bible studies are good. Bible studies are great. You grow in your understanding of God. I'm not saying don't have that. But if you want your faith to really grow and really become strong, and you want to be confident in God, then decide to use your influence to help others tell a better story, because the real story of God that's found in the powerful book of the Bible becomes real life for you. And suddenly you're seeing the world through the lens that God sees the world through. And it's not about you. It's about what God wants to do in you and through you. You want your faith to grow? Then use your influence to help others tell a better story. This last week, we sat down with a few different friends and we interviewed them and asked them about them using their influence to help others tell a better story. Friends, we got so much content that we're not able to use it all today. So we're gonna use it over the next few weeks, but there's a story that we wanted to share with you today. So here's what I wanna do. I'm gonna pray for you. And then when I say amen at both locations, you just relax. You relax. Because our teams are gonna come out on stage. They're gonna lead us in a moment. They're gonna share a song with us. And as they share this song with us, you're gonna hear a story from 2 real incredible friends, Judy and Joey. And it's gonna wreck you. But I want you to hear about the power of influence, helping others tell a better story. And then at the end of this thing, I want you to pay a close attention to what Joey says about himself. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, the responsibility that comes with using our influence to help others tell a better story is a heavy one. But we don't have to do it alone. We have you. We don't have to go on our own. You go with us. God, I pray that we would move what we should do from ambiguous generalities and shrink it to specific, intentional relationships. That when we think about who's becoming better because of us, we would have a name and a face of someone we love. And that we're not fixing them. We're loving them. And we're loving them by pointing them in the direction of the God who loves them most. So as we hear these stories, may we be reminded that what we hear and experience today can take place in our life today. Thanks for that privilege, that honor, and that courage. In Jesus' name, we pray all these things. Amen, and amen, and amen.
Thank you again for joining us for this week's message. We believe your generosity is changing the world. If you'd like to partner with us, click the link in the description below. And we'll see you again next week.